Hello, my name is Joe and welcome to my channel. I have a question for you. What's your favorite fairy tale? I myself am not well versed enough in fairy tales to say I'd really have a favorite. What I do enjoy, though, are fairy tale adaptations. The ways that creators adapt these timeless stories to suit a different setting, I find really awakens creativity in a person and allows for some very interesting tales. It's one of the reasons I enjoy the way RWBY characters are made so much. Seeing how they are adapted from their original fairy tale counterparts into such a different setting that Remnant is very fascinating. This vaguely dystopian world where you can have Little Red Riding Hood running around with a sniper rifle shooting monsters is just really, really cool. Another thing I enjoy about the way RWBY characters are created is that due to them being based on fairy tales, it opens up a lot of possibilities for different interpretations and theories as to how their stories will be adapted. It even gives the chance to possibly discern the different kind of characters that will be introduced later. Many people in the community already knew that the Headmaster of Shade would likely be an adaptation of Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz before the RWBY novels came out, and this was because of the inspiration of the other headmasters being other characters from The Wizard of Oz. One group of particularly interesting characters to think of who they might be inspired by are the beings within the relics. So, that's what we'll do today. We'll look at the different relics and think about who they might be connected to in terms of their fairy tales, as well as what that might mean for who uses those relics or how they are used. Before I begin, I would like to point out that a lot of this theory is inspired by Phoenix Knight's own theory on who the relics might be linked to, and thus I'll be referencing that video at different points within this one, so I would recommend going to check it out. I'll put a card on the screen as well as a link in the description. So you did it? Cool. Let's get started. Also, this theory is only really half built on actual evidence and half what I think would be cool story beats, so take all this with a grain of salt. Now, the first thing I need to point out is that we don't necessarily know all of the relics will have some being like Jinn in them. However, the sequence with both the Lamp of Knowledge and the Staff of Creation in the Volume 8 intro seems to indicate, to me at least, that they will. So, we're just gonna go with it. To determine who they might be, we have to think about the entity we already know the inspiration for. Jinn, who was inspired by the genie from Aladdin. Knowing this gives us the opportunity to discern possibilities for what criteria the beings within the relics might fall under, and give us a chance to, after that, discern their possible identities. Phoenix Knight proposed the theory that all of them would be based on characters from fairy tales that just help the protagonist along with magical powers, oftentimes being more of a plot convenience than an actual character. I somewhat agree with this, but I also think it goes a bit deeper than that. Also, I think it's a bit of a disservice to describe the genie from Aladdin like that, but regardless. While we know that Jinn is based off the genie from Aladdin, we can also determine that she is based more heavily on the Disney adaptation rather than the original fairy tale. In the original version, the genie wasn't limited to 3 wishes, simply serving those who rubbed the lamp, and there also didn't seem to be any indication of him being blue. Because Jinn is both limited to 3 questions, as well as being visually inspired by the Disney version, we can make an assumption it is based more heavily on said version. While this is probably due to Disney having one of the most popular interpretations of that character, it does open up a possible extra criteria we could use to narrow our scope. In conjunction with this idea, we also know that the Relic of Creation is the same gold and blue coloration as the Relic of Knowledge. Due to this, we can probably assume that the entities within them, as well as probably the other 2 as well, will share a similar color scheme. Combining all of these factors, I propose that the beings within the relics will not only be magical benefactors to the heroes, but will also be characters that have been adapted to Disney films, along with being generally themed with the blue color. While this might be a bit too specific, I feel the narrower scope could help hone in our predictions. Also, I am aware that the Relic of Choice was technically shown in the Fairy Tales of Remnant book, as being a gold crown with red gems. However, that is still technically a fairy tale within the world of Remnant, so we should take the description with a grain of salt. So, given these parameters, I think we can pretty easily narrow down who the next three beings could be based on. Let's start with the one we're most likely to see next, that being the entity housed within the Relic of Creation. Phoenix Knight, as well as many others, have proposed that it might be the Blue Fairy, and I completely agree with this. A blue magical benefactor from an animated Disney film? She fits our criteria perfectly. And given Penny is so intrinsically linked to the Atlas storyline, and this volume focuses on her so much, it would make sense for something connected to our inspiration storyline to be used for the relic. Now, one detractor from this theory that I have seen said is that we already have an analog for the Blue Fairy, that being Freya from Volume 7. She, in a way, made Penny a real girl by transferring to her the maiden powers. While I do think that was the intention, I don't think it actually makes it so the being within the relic can't also be the Blue Fairy. We've seen multiple characters be inspired by the same source material before. I talked about Theodore, the headmaster from Shade, being inspired by Dorothy, but we've also seen characters like Oscar and Ruby take somewhat of a Dorothy role in certain regards. There's also another thing to suggest the Blue Fairy theory might be the case, but we'll get into that in a bit. Next up is the Relic of Destruction. In Phoenix Knight's video, he mentions that since it's a sword, it could be inspired by, arguably, the most famous sword in all of fiction, Excalibur. And I, once again, completely agree with this. What I don't agree with, however, is his assertion that the being within the sword will be based on the Lady of the Lake. While I think it's a really good theory, probably better than my own, it doesn't match with my more narrow criteria I proposed, given the Lady of the Lake hasn't appeared in an animated Disney film. She did appear in Gargoyles, but I think that's kind of stretching the criteria. However, there is a film adaptation of King Arthur's story, well, kind of, at least. That being The Sword and the Stone. And you know who does appear in that film as a blue-themed magical benefactor to our hero? Merlin. It would make sense. Merlin is present in most adaptation of King Arthur's story, and probably even more often than the Lady of the Lake is. If this is the case, it also opens up for some interesting opportunities for storytelling. In The Sword and the Stone, Merlin's big lesson to Arthur, or wart in that, is that size and strength aren't important. It's brains that matter. It would present an interesting dichotomy where the Relic of Destruction doesn't get its true strength from large-scale beams of devastation, but from more subtle, intellect-based approaches. I still think it'll be able to send out giant Kamehamehas of power, but that won't be its greatest strength. Finally, we have the Relic of Choice. And Phoenix Knight's theory on this is it's Glinda. Just Glinda. I disagree with this. It may very well be the case, and I'll have egg on my face if it is, but I personally have a different idea. The maiden associated with the Relic of Choice, the one who would have been in charge of keeping it safe if it wasn't for Ozpin pulling a sneaky on us, was the Fall Maiden. And what character do we associate with the Fall Maiden most? Amber and Pyrrha are both connected to the story, but the Fall Maiden we have seen since the very first episode, even if maidens technically weren't a thing then, was Cinder. Cinder, based on Cinderella. And who is Cinderella's blue-themed magical benefactor? Her fairy godmother. Now, I know what you're thinking. But Joe, Cinder already has her fairy godmother with Salem. While that is true, we've already established that there can be multiple analogs for the same character. Salem herself is based off of multiple characters, with her primary inspiration being the Wicked Witch of the West. As such, I don't see a reason why we can't have a more benevolent version of Cinderella's benefactor appearing, as well as opening up an opportunity for Cinder to make a choice. But we'll get more into that later. And I'm actually going to split up the video here. This turned out longer than I expected, so yeah. If you're watching this, the next part should be up either now or soon. Until then, safe journeys, my friends.